Ajoke's hands shook as she stared at the small plastic stick in front of her. The two bold lines on the pregnancy test seemed to scream at her louder than any voice could. She felt the room spin as the realization set in. She was pregnant. And the father of her child, her stomach churned as the thought threatened to overwhelm her. She clutched the edge of the bathroom sink, trying to steady herself, but the memories flooded in, crashing over her like a tidal wave. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to forget, but the images came anyway. Tony's face, his hands, the cold, detached look in his eyes. She remembered how he had approached her that day, how he had smiled, a smile that once seemed warm and brotherly but now filled her with dread. He had been so kind when she first came to live with them. Banmi, her older sister, had welcomed her with open arms, excited to have Ajoke live with her in Lagos. It was supposed to be a fresh start after their parents passed away. But Tony had other plans. The beginning of the nightmare. It started with the glances. At first, Ajoke thought she was imagining it. Tony was Banmi's husband, a man she respected and trusted. But as the weeks passed, those glances became touches, innocent at first, a hand on her shoulder, a pat on the back. But then they lingered too long, his hand would brush against hers, his eyes roaming where they shouldn't. Ajoke's discomfort grew, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Banmi. How could she? Banmi was so happy, so in love with her husband. Ajoke didn't want to be the one to ruin that. One afternoon, when Banmi was out running errands with the children, Tony cornered her in the living room. Ajoke had been sitting on the couch reading a book when she felt his presence beside her. She looked up, startled to see him standing so close. Ajoke, he began, his voice smooth, you've grown into such a beautiful young woman. It's no wonder all the boys in the neighborhood are after you. Ajoke shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile. Thank you, brother Tony, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Tony sat down next to her, too close for comfort. You know, he continued, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Ajoke's heart raced. She could feel the tension in the air, something dark and foreboding. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before she could react, Tony reached out and took her hand in his. His grip was firm, almost painful. I've noticed how you look at me, Ajoke, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You want this as much as I do, don't you? Ajoke's eyes widened in shock. No. I don't, she stammered, trying to pull her hand away, but Tony's grip tightened. Don't play games with me, he hissed, his face inches from hers. I know you want me. It's okay, you don't have to hide it. Banmi doesn't have to know. Ajoke's mind raced. She had never looked at Tony that way, never even considered it. The very thought made her sick. But she could see the determination in his eyes, the dangerous glint that told her he wouldn't take no for an answer. Please, Tony, let go of me, she pleaded, panic rising in her chest. But Tony didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. You're going to be mine, Ajoke. Whether you like it or not. The violation. That was the first time Tony tried to force himself on her. Ajoke managed to escape that day, locking herself in her room until Banmi returned. But the fear didn't go away. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she saw Tony, her stomach would twist in knots. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to tell Banmi. How could she? Banmi was so happy, and Ajoke didn't want to be the one to shatter that happiness. But Tony was relentless. He began to find excuses to be alone with her, to corner her when Banmi was out. Ajoke started avoiding him, staying out late, pretending to be sick, anything to keep away from him. But it wasn't enough. One fateful evening, Banmi had taken the children to visit a friend, leaving Ajoke and Tony alone in the house. Ajoke had retreated to her room, trying to keep her distance, but Tony wasn't about to let her hide. He knocked on her door, the sound echoing through the silent house. "Ajoke," he called out, his voice deceptively gentle. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Ajoke froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, he knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just a crack, enough to see Tony's face. "What do you want, Tony?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tony smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I just want to talk, Ajoke. Let me in." Reluctantly, Ajoke stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Tony walked in, closing the door behind him. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. "Ajoke," he began, his tone soft, almost coaxing, "You know I care about you, don't you?" Ajoke nodded slowly, unsure of where this was going. "I've been thinking," Tony continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small bottle of pills. "You seem so stressed lately. I thought this might help you relax." Ajoke eyed the pills warily. "What are those?" she asked. "Just something to help you sleep," Tony replied, shaking the bottle lightly. "You've been so tense lately, and I want you to feel better." Ajoke didn't trust him, but before she could say anything, Tony poured a few pills into his hand and offered them to her. "Come on, Ajoke," he urged. "I'm just trying to help." Hesitantly, Ajoke took the pills from his hand, but something in her gut told her not to swallow them. She held them in her hand, staring at them, trying to decide what to do. Tony watched her closely, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Take them," he insisted, his voice low and commanding. Ajoke felt her hands shaking as she raised the pills to her mouth. She couldn't refuse him, not when he was like this. She popped the pills into her mouth but didn't swallow. Instead, she pretended to gulp them down, hiding them under her tongue. Tony's expression softened, pleased that she had complied. "Good girl," he murmured, stepping closer to her. Ajoke felt her body tense as he reached out to touch her face. His fingers were cold, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "You're so beautiful, Ajoke," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "I've wanted you for so long." Ajoke's heart raced, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body felt frozen in place. She knew what was coming, he knew she couldn't stop it. Tony's hands moved to her shoulders, his grip firm as he pushed her down onto the bed. Ajoke's mind went blank with fear as he climbed on top of her, his weight pinning her down. "Please, Tony, don't do this," she begged, tears streaming down her face. But Tony didn't listen. He pressed his lips against hers, his hands roaming over her body as he took what he wanted. Ajoke tried to fight, tried to push him away, but she was too weak, too scared. All she could do was cry as Tony violated her, taking everything from her in one horrifying moment. The aftermath. When it was over, Tony rolled off her, leaving Ajoke lying there, broken and numb. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Her body ached, her mind a whirlwind of pain and confusion. Tony stood up, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened. He looked down at Ajoke, a satisfied smile on his face. "Remember," he said, his voice cold and threatening, "if you tell anyone about this, I will kill you. Do you understand?" Ajoke didn't respond, her mind too shattered to process his words. She just nodded weakly, tears blurring her vision. Tony left the room, closing the door behind him, leaving Ajoke alone in the dark. She curled up on the bed, her body trembling as she cried herself to sleep.